In the previous section, I explained that the classificatory principle that separates live performance and technologically mediated performance by qualifying the performer-spectator relationship in terms of space and time is no longer adequate. Notwithstanding this outmoded classificatory principle prevails in many fields of study, including theater and performance studies. Thus, in this section, I will examine and critique those theories in performance scholarship that sustain and perpetuate this classification. Formative theorists in performance studies, such as Richard Schechner and Peggy Phelan, defined performance as practices that are unrecorded, in opposition with performances that are technologically mediated, such as cinema and television. Increasingly, theorists challenged this polar opposition because, as they noted, contemporary theater productions often integrate both live performance and technologically mediated performance. However, theorists such as Philip Auslander are misguided if they believe that this ambivalence subverts the alleged ontology of performance. For instance, if we map a hybrid, i.e. intermedial production such as Intoleranza, which merges live performance and technologically mediated performance, onto the prevailing model, we see that live performance, or the live, is clearly delineated, i.e. ontologically distinct. It is important to realize that live and recorded are mere labels. They do not define the respective categories. Essentially, theorists and performance scholarship who take issue with whether or not those hybrids are generally live or can be validly described as live performance are not addressing an ontological crisis, but a mere semantic technicality. A classificatory model is ruled not only by the way that the respective phenomena are defined, but also by the semantic relationships between the terminologies that label those phenomena. For instance, in everyday life, the words humans and animals are opposites. Conversely, biologists define the category of humans as a subcategory of the category of animals. Hence, in the context of biology, the words humans and animals are not opposites. In sum, it is not because terminologies identify mutually exclusive phenomena in one context that the phenomena that those terminologies identify in a different context are equally mutually exclusive. Even so, the semantic opposition between humans and animals sustains the popular, yet non-scientific, preconception that the categories humans and animals are dichotomous. By the same token, it is the oppositional relationship between live and recorded, which is valid in the context of broadcasting, that upholds the conviction that the categories the live and the recorded are dichotomous, which, as we will see, is unfounded. Marvin Carson, for instance, has written prolifically about theater productions that include video that is produced live on the stage before a live audience, and for which he coined the term roving eye productions. As I discussed in the previous presentation, both sign systems, live performance, and video that is produced live on the stage before a live audience are defined in identical terms, because the spectators share a spatiotemporal frame with the performers acting on the stage, and the spectators equally share a spatiotemporal frame with the performers whose performance is technologically mediated. In sum, live video is an instance of two categories that are allegedly mutually exclusive. This anomaly amounts to an ontological crisis. Even so, Carson ignores the ontological crisis and equally negates that the inability to delineate both sign systems compromises the study of semiosis. Apparently, Carlson believes that since roving eye productions mirror practices that are both live, their ontological status as live, i.e. unrecorded, is unthreatened. However, it is not because live and live identify equivalent phenomena in one context that the phenomena that those terms describe in a different context are equally equivalent. In sum, Carlson, like Auslander, conflates the relationships between the terminologies that identify the categories with the way that the categories are defined. They ignore the actual problem, which is the inadequate classificatory principle that separates live performance and technologically mediated performance by qualifying the performer-spectator relationship in terms of space and time. Let's consider another case. Most, if not all theorists in performance scholarship consider a staged reading a manifestation of live performance. And yet, the performers are reading their lines from a script. So, by the predicate that the live and the recorded are mutually exclusive, a scripted reading should not be deemed a live performance. That is, unless one negates that scripts are recordings, which is exactly what theorists in performance scholarship do. They exclude scripted materials from the category the recorded to maintain that a staged reading is a manifestation of live performance. Let's consider another example of this strategy. For instance, many theorists in performance scholarship consider productions that use microphones on the stage still a live performance. And yet, a vocal performance that is amplified is undeniably technologically mediated. Thus, again, by the definition that the live and the recorded are mutually exclusive, performances that use amplification technologies are hybrids and thus not instances of the live. In performance scholarship, hybrids, i.e. productions that integrate technologies such as video, computer animation, virtual actors, and so on, are also called intermedial performance. However, intermedial performances are hybrid that merge live performance and technologically mediated performance. Essentially, the moniker intermedial performance serves as a pragmatic solution to negotiate the alleged dichotomy between the live and the recorded. So this identifies the two strategies that theorists in performance scholarship deploy to uphold the polarity between live performance and technologically mediated performance. They define the recorded reductively, and they create new labels that normalize hybrids. Both strategies serve the same purpose, namely to create a false binary. Lastly, let's interrogate what many consider a pristine manifestation of live performance, namely our everyday conversations and interactions. Everyday conversations and interactions are considered live because they're spontaneous, unique, unrehearsed, and so on. However, everything we say, everything we think, everything we do is rooted in past experiences, and therefore those performances are the product of a process of recording. Thus, those who claim that everyday conversations are instances of the live construe a reductive definition of the recorded, one that excludes non-technological means of recording, such as memorization and embodiment, and privileges technological means of recording. Moreover, since everything we do is the product of a process of recording, the category the live is a subcategory of the category the recorded, i.e., live performance and technologically mediated performance are opposites within the category the recorded. At a conference I presented at, the comment was made that I was merely turning the tables, and that I was bent on expanding the definition of the recorded to argue that the live and the recorded are not dichotomous categories. This, however, is not quite the point that I am arguing. Let's revert, once again, to our humans versus animals analogy. Clearly, both theories, the popular view that humans are not animals and the scientifically sound statement that humans are animals, are equally meaningful, that is, within their respective contexts. With that being said, the notion that humans and animals are dichotomous categories hinges on a classificatory principle that is not scientifically sound, and therefore has no place in biology. Thus, my point is that the notion that the live and the recorded are dichotomous has no place in a field of study that claims or that aspires to be scientific, including performance studies. Consequently, the concept of liveness, which in performance scholarship serves as a classificatory principle that undergirds this unfounded polarity, equally needs to be abandoned. As we have seen, theorists in performance scholarship apply two strategies to uphold the dichotomy between the live and the recorded. They define the recorded reductively and they relabel hybrids. It is evident that those strategies are unproductive, not only because they elude the ontological crisis, but moreover because they perpetuate a classificatory model that is no longer effective. Let's consider a couple more theorizations to show that this malaise is pervasive in performance scholarship. For instance, in response to Philip Auslander's destabilization of the concept of liveness, theorists in performance scholarship have tried to define the specificity of live performance in terms other than liveness, such as risk, variability, unpredictability, uniqueness, intimacy, presence, and so on. Consider, for instance, Elizabeth Bell, who situates the distinctiveness of live performance in the sense of peril, i.e., danger, risk, unpredictability. Now, if we analyze Bell's construction, we realize that she deems live performance riskful and unpredictable because it is unrecorded, just like a movie is deemed predictable and without risk because the actor's performance is recorded. In other words, when Bell contrasts live performance and technologically mediated performance on the basis of risk or unpredictability, she reiterates the dichotomy between live and recorded. In sum, concepts such as risk, unpredictability, intimacy, uniqueness, and so on serve as mere placeholders for liveness. Equally unproductive is a classificatory principle such as presence. I am not referring to presence as a spatio-temporal concept, which we already discarded, but to presence as a psychological concept, meaning charisma, magnetism, aura, and so on. Those concepts are subjective, or more precisely, they are inexact. Clearly, classificatory principles that are inexact have no place in scientific pursuits. In a similar vein, Philip Auslander speculated that live and liveness have now become effective concepts. However, effective means that a performance is live because it feels live. In sum, this classificatory principle is inexact and for that same reason unfit in a scientific context. To be clear, I do not refute that for many spectators and for theorists studying spectatorship, charisma, spontaneity, the sense of risk, unpredictability, and so on are meaningful concepts. However, my point is that those concepts do not define live performance in opposition with technologically mediated performance. Some theorists realized that technologically mediated performances can be equally unique or interactive. Richard Schechner, for instance, concedes that live performance and technologically mediated performance can equally provide unique experiences. However, when Schechner articulates the distinction in such terms as more live versus less live, he identifies a shared quality, which defeats our purpose, that is, to define live performance and technologically mediated performance in opposition. As I explained, the terms live and recorded are not opposites in the context of theater, performance arts, and everyday interactions, i.e., manifestations of performance whereby the performer and the spectator share a spatio-temporal frame. Live and recorded are, however, opposites in the context of broadcast production. This raises the question, how did this dichotomy migrate into performance scholarship? As we have seen, the polarity between technologically mediated performance as recorded and performance as not recorded was advanced by formative theorists in performance studies. Since performance was defined as not recorded, the idea that performance must therefore be live was the next step. This semantic transition also involved a shift in emphasis, from performance thought of as unrecorded towards performance conceived of as primarily live. The coinage of the composite term live performance further consolidated this perception. This privileging of performance's liveness is evident from writings by theorists such as Joseph Roche, Diana Taylor, and Rebecca Schneider, amongst others. Like other theorists, they have tried to come to terms with this troubling incongruity by construing reductive definitions of the recorded. To conclude, in this presentation I have explained that the polarity between the live and the recorded is ideological, i.e., not scientifically sound, and therefore has no place in performance scholarship. Equally scientifically unfounded is the concept of liveness, which needs to be abandoned in performance scholarship. Central to my argument is the thesis that the terms live and recorded do not identify dichotomous phenomena. They do, however, when they are used in relation to broadcast technologies, meaning a television or radio show is either live or recorded. It is true that this dichotomy has been and continues to be challenged by theorists in broadcast studies. In the next presentation, I will explain the origin of this debate and why those theorists are mistaken.